Good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and we are continuing our series on the formation of the deep state. And of course, now we are into the third such war that this power elite, these corporatists, these owners, some people call them robber barons, have sort of negotiated us into. We began with the Spanish-American War, World War, which was essentially to create the foreign empire that they needed for their resources and their markets, overseas territories, etc., and the fulfillment of their social Darwinian perspective of life. World War One was the protection or the to maintain that empire and to be at the peace table so that we could keep our empire after World War One. The maps were redrawn. World War Two is going to be about expanding it. And of course, every subsequent war, once you have an empire foreign, every subsequent war, we have to have our say. We have to be involved in some manner, shape, form, because when it's over and the peace treaty is being drawn up, we got to be at the table. We got to protect what's ours. So we are talking about how we got into World War II. And I told you today's episode, which is chapter 20, would hopefully, if I achieve my objective, will convince you that we get into World War II for the same reasons we got into World War One, for the same reasons we got into the Spanish-American War, and using the same methods, uh, uh, essentially propagandizing the American people through either a yellow press or a British-controlled press when they cut the transatlantic cable, which they did in World War One, they'll do again in World War Two. So all our information comes filtered through our special ally, which in both World War One, World War Two, Britain is involved in both those wars before we are, and both need us in the war to prevent them from losing. So they have very serious motives to want to slant the news coverage in their direction. The second method was the either manufacture of evidence or the suppression of evidence. And in both World War One and Spanish American War was the manufacture of evidence. The alleged letter from the Spanish ambassador, which got the American people fired up and jingoistic when the Spanish ambassador allegedly insulted President McKinley, called him weak and stupid. We never saw the letter. It was never produced. The British just told us they had it and reported it to us. And then in World War One, it was again, another letter, the Zimmerman note, which was allegedly from German's foreign minister to Mexico, offering them all the lost territories in the United States back if they would help Germany defeat America in World War One. Of course, America wasn't in the war yet, but that was the point. Again, we never saw the letter. It was never produced. It was reported to us through this British controlled or British filtered press. And it was sufficient to push us closer to getting into the war. And then the third step was the false flag attacks, whereby Americans actually died and was blamed on the enemy. Again, to the help of that either yellow press in the Spanish-American War case or the British-controlled press in World War One's case. In the Spanish-American War, it was the USS Maine we intentionally sent to harm's way and blew it up ourselves, blamed the Spanish. In World War One, it was the Lusitania, a British ship sailing under an American flag, full of Americans being sent intentionally into harm's way, knowing it would be sunk. And it would outrage Americans to know that Americans died sunk by a torpedo from a German sub when Americans were not even at war. And it would be perceived as an attack against a neutral country when it was really a British ship and it was full of contraband. It was all intentional. So uh, these these events constitute treason. So that's starting with the Spanish-American Wars when the power elites transitioned from just treachery against the American people to treason against the American nation. And we're going to see all these same methods again in World War II. It's going to be a replay. This is why they fight so hard to protect their methods. They don't want the American people wise to their methods because they use them over and over again. When we left off yesterday, we've been going through the backstory. And of course, it was the buildup to this eventual precipitating event at Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese are to the point now, because of the oil embargo, that they have a decision to make. And the decision is, if we wait this out, America gets stronger. If we strike now, we could possibly strike such a decisive blow that it incapacitates the American naval fleet in the Pacific to such a degree that we can run around the Pacific, do anything we want, and they have no leverage because they have no navy. And now their West Coast is at risk. They're vulnerable for the first time. America sits over there between two oceans and feels so secure. All of a sudden, they won't be so secure. So when we go back to the negotiating table, we'll have leverage to get our oil back. That's the whole point. Yamamoto, the admiral coming up with this plan, it was based or revolved around oil, timing, and bargaining. The oil is the objective. We've got to get our oil back. The United States has cut off our oil supply. Timing, if we're going to get our oil back, we're going to have to attack the Americans, let them know we're serious, and so damage their Pacific fleet that they will sue for peace to prevent us from marching on California or Hawaii, for example. And the price tag will be a resumption of the oil exports or imports, all of which is about bargaining. The Japanese had very little bargaining position with the Americans, and Yamamoto was trying to give them a bargaining position. And oil is the key point here. Without oil, Japan's empire or military dreams of conquest in the Far East die. And of course, we've already learned they tried it through peaceful means to feed their industrial machine and create export products that people would buy, that they could import, buy enough food to import, feed their own people, their growing empire of people. And they learned doing it the peaceful way only raised, their economic growth was only 3.3%. But when they did it through military conquest, expanded their empire that way, their economic growth rate was 7.2%. So they feel like this is an existential crisis for them. We have to be able to use our military to conquer, to expand our empire, if we are going to continue to feed our people, if we are going to exist as a sovereign, independent nation. So this is to them life or death. The preemptive strike on Pearl Harbor, a lot of people assume that was about defeating America. There was no illusions. Admiral Yamamoto and tojo operated under no illusions that an attack on the naval fleet in Hawaii was going to defeat the Americans. It just wasn't going to happen. But it was about forcing the Americans back to the negotiating table. And this time, the Japanese would have all the leverage. That's the whole point. And at that moment, the Japanese didn't fear the U.S. Navy because they had more carriers than the Americans did. Thus they had more planes on those carriers. They had, obviously, if they had more carriers, they had more carrier groups. Even though America had technically the second largest navy in the world at that time, behind only Great Britain, Japan was not afraid of it. Japan did not. In fact, what they thought was, if there was ever a time to attack, it's now. Now, in 2 years, it may not be the case. And indeed, that was, they have their spies in America. They know that America has 27 aircraft carriers on order. It takes a couple years to build these things. So they know in a couple of years, they're going to have the United States will have vastly more naval power at their disposal than the Japanese. If they're ever going to attack, it's now. All of these aircraft carriers would be built within 2 years. So the Japanese, which only had 11 at this time, was still more than the Americans had in 1941. But if you fast forward to 1943, the Americans will have 27 plus whatever survive from there. I think they had 7 at this time. So they could have possibly 30, 34, 33, 34. You know, that's over 3 times what the Japanese ever had, their high water mark. So they know this is the time. The Americans have such an industrial capacity, they can quickly catch up and pass us by building all these carriers. We got to attack now. So Tojo, prime minister, who's made the decision that we're going to continue to expand, which has put him on a headline collision path with U.S. foreign policy. He's not going back, but there is an obstacle in his way. It's FDR, it's United States of America. And he realizes if he wants to continue in Manchuria and get those resources, if he wants to continue in the Dutch East Indies and get those resources, if he wants to continue in Malaya and all those countless Pacific islands, he's going to have to defeat or at least send a message to the Americans that they're on equal footing. And the Americans, he knows, are obsessed with what's going on in Europe right now, especially with respect to its main ally, Britain. And Britain desperately wants them in the war. Tojo is not worried about the British and their Navy. You say, well, why not? Well, because they're tied up with Germany right now. And so he can root around in Malaya and other British colonies and not really worry so much about the British Navy because the British Navy is otherwise occupied. The American Navy is not. So he's going to have to deal with the American Navy. Now, he knows that because he's allied himself with Germany and Italy, at such time as he attacks the Americans are going to declare war on him. And that will put the Americans in an unenviable situation where they have to fight 2 enemies simultaneously. Because Britain obviously wants them on their side to help fight the Germans. And now the Americans are going to have this quandary because they're going to be fighting the Japanese as well. That could put the Americans in a situation where they're fighting a 2-front war. So that's why they allied with Germany. They know what's coming, and they think Germany can help them gain that leverage against the United States because the United States is going to be, their forces are going to be spread thin. They're going to be fighting two enemies at the same time. They don't know that the Americans are going to make a choice, prioritize one over the other. They're thinking they're going to have to fight both. So Tojo makes that decision. No more negotiating with the United States, at least not real negotiating. It's going to be, there's going to be a ruse, kind of a charade of negotiating just to fool the Americans. But this is now, they're in the planning stages of a preemptive first strike. They know that and that preemptive strike has to be decisive. It just has to be decisive. Here's a picture of Yamamoto on the left and the foreign minister Matsuoka on the right. And in the lead up to this strike and during the planning of this strike at Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto and Matsuoka are both instrumental because they've been to America and they know the American people. They've been educated in America. And Yamamoto was famous for saying, quote, "I've seen these people. They have nice cars and they wear spats." This is a dismissive view Yamamoto has of the American people and the attention that they're paying to the problems around them. They're so caught up in their own lives and their pleasures and et cetera, that they are vulnerable to a preemptive strike. Now, the Americans wake up. He knows that. And in another quote, he says, after Pearl Harbor, I fear we have awoken a sleeping giant. And he knows if it's not decisive, it could be fatal. It's got to be decisive. But a preemptive first strike is the way to go because he thinks the Americans are asleep at the switch. Matsuoka says, quote, "Any country that will not come to the aid of Britain while it's burning down surely won't care about a few battleships and carriers in Pearl Harbor." This is something that the Japanese have noticed. While the British are literally the only allied force, I say allied because there really aren't any allies yet, they're standing alone against the onslaught of the Germans and the Italians. And they have this special ally, this special relationship with the United States. The United States won't come in and join the war effort. So this just reinforces in their view this perspective that on the American people, the American nation, foreign policy, and our government, that we're selfish, that we only we're not interested in our allies, we're only interested in ourselves. And so Yamamoto is fully convinced that Pearl Harbor is the place for this preemptive strike. And there's some reasons for it. We're going to get into it. He thinks the element of surprise is going to be elevated because the American people think, the American Naval Command think that Pearl Harbor is invulnerable to an attack by air for a couple of reasons we'll get into. So Pearl Harbor becomes the place for this attack. And he's considering all these different factors. A, the American people are asleep at the switch, in his view. They're caught up in the their own problems. And there's a Great Depression going on. They're caught up in their jobs and their own lives, and they feel this false sense of security because of these two oceans. And he just, having been in America, he just feels like Americans have this sense that no one will mess with them. They may have to go and help somebody, an ally, fight over in faraway places, but no one will ever attack America itself. It's never happened. So why would they think that? And the fact that America hasn't come to the aid of Britain indicates to them an unwillingness to fight. We'll send aid over through cash and carry and lend-lease, but we don't want to get our hands dirty. And Japan says we're going to force America to get its hands dirty, or we're going to take advantage of the fact they don't want to get their hands dirty. So he basically lays down an ultimatum, says, I will resign if you don't let me do Pearl Harbor. He's telling everybody in Japan, the Naval Command, of course, this is top secret, but this is where the attack has to happen. There's some disagreement over that. He feels like that's the place. And so, and he feels like a surprise preemptive strike, if it's decisive, could accomplish all the objectives the Japanese have. So we know the story. December 7th, 1941, the surprise attack happens. Now, it's a surprise, and I put a question mark there because I don't think it was a surprise. And I'll hopefully prove my point here as we go forward. But the Japanese are operating on the assumption the Americans are surprised. It's on a Sunday morning. They picked that intentionally. That's when Americans go to church, right? It's sort of like it's not spoken, it's an unspoken rule. You don't attack another nation on their holy day or whatever. So Americans would presumably be in church. And of all the 7 days, that's the one to, if you want to make it a surprise, that's the day to choose. Also, there was a delegation, a Japanese delegation, at the moment that the attack began, sitting in the White House, carrying out this ruse of peace negotiations. They have no illusions about the prospect of these negotiations being successful, which is why the attacks are scheduled to begin as soon as they leave the White House grounds. But it's another way to cause the American people to drop their guard a little bit. And so we literally have, and this is one of the things that infuriated the American people, by the way, when they found out the fact that the Japanese would be so duplicitous. Imagine that during war, right? All is fair in love and war. That's what they say. But so in the American people's view, they were so duplicitous as to send peace negotiations, a delegation to the White House, pretending like they were seriously negotiating for peace, while at the same time their planes are en route to Pearl Harbor. Of course, the goals are to wipe out the Pacific Fleet. Now, they had spies in and around Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and Oahu there that had kept meticulous records of the scheduled maneuvers of the Pacific Fleet. And they knew better than the Americans when those carriers, when those ships are on maneuvers out in the ocean itself, when they're supposed to be in dry dock, when they're parked and being, loaded up for another maneuver, whatever. when they're going to be in the base, for how long, and when they're going to be out at sea. They have it down to a science. They know exactly, this is how you prepare an attack of this sort. You got to make sure that the ships that you're targeting are going to be there when your planes arrive. It doesn't make any sense to launch an attack and get there and the ships are all gone out to sea and on maneuvers. The Pacific Ocean's a big ocean. Good luck trying to find them. So they had prepared meticulously in advance through their network of spies in Pearl Harbor, in and around Pearl Harbor. They wanted to know when the planes are going to be on the landing strips lined up like cordwood. They wanted to know when the carriers are going to be in the docks lined up like cordwood. They wanted to know when the battleships, everything was going to be there. And they picked December 7th, A, because it's a Sunday, B, because this is the weekend when all these ships are going to be in port. They're not at sea. And that's the way they've scheduled 3 rounds or 3 waves of attack. And the way Pearl Harbor is configured, even if a ship tries to escape, or ships plural try to escape in between those waves of attack, the Japanese have an answer for that. And that will trap the rest of the ships, and they'll be merciless, or I mean, not merciless, they'll be helpless in the face of the second wave and the third wave as the Japanese just come in and sink all of the ships. And of course, the first thing they're going to do is blow up all the planes so that they can't be counterattacked in the air. They have it all laid out, they have it all worked out. And afterwards, on their way back, the U.S. is going to calculate the damage and realize, holy cow, they have completely wiped out. Remember, we only had a one ocean navy at this time. And this is the Pacific Fleet is a large portion of the Navy. And if they wipe that out, the Japanese will be literally they can attack anybody in the Pacific at will. They don't have to worry about the British because the British are worried about the Germans. They don't have to worry about the Americans because they took care of the Americans. So this is a very key part of the strategy. There is a aerial view of some of the ships lined up as the Japanese knew that they would be. This is coming in on the first wave as they are just starting to drop the bombs. You can see the ships are lined up 2 abreast. This is the view of these Japanese pilots. Now, I mentioned that the United States thought that Pearl Harbor was impervious to an air attack. And if it was a naval attack by water, it would take so long for them to get there. And of course, they'd have to get close, and American radar would pick them up. So really what they're worried about is an air attack. But the air, that the distance from Japan would require a lot of carriers get close enough for these planes to take off and land and can carry out their mission and turn around and go back and land on them. And again, radar would pick up those carriers. The distance is so great, and you're talking about a vast ocean. The other reason was shallow water. Pearl Harbor has unusually shallow water, and all of the torpedoes dropped from planes, at least as far as the Americans knew, would, just because that's the technology that we had available to us, is they tested it, and if you drop these torpedoes from planes, they would literally bury themselves in the mud at the bottom of the harbor because it was too shallow. And these torpedoes, as they dropped, just because of sheer gravity and the weight of the torpedo when it hit the water, as it was sinking, these things are set to go off at either water pressure when it hits a certain water pressure or a certain depth, but it wasn't deep enough. And so they said, well, you can't attack Pearl Harbor from air because of the shallow water. What they didn't know, what we didn't know, is that the Japanese had invented a new torpedo called a shallow water torpedo, pictured here. This is the remains of one. And the shallow water torpedo gave the Japanese the capability to attack even in shallow water because these are set to go off almost on impact. And they'd sink maybe 2 feet into the water and then begin their approach towards the ships, and they would blow up had a much shallower, they didn't require the deep water, is my point. They didn't have to be out in the open ocean. So we didn't know they had these shallow water torpedoes. We thought that the shallow water protected us from air. We thought radar would detect any movement of the Japanese naval in our direction. And then they thought, well, we had broken their code. This is actually the biggest piece of evidence that we knew that we allowed the attack to happen. We knew it was happening. We knew it was coming. We knew everything in advance because we had broken their code, and we had code breaking machines, Magic and Ultra, that were literally spitting out into the hands of all of our naval command or anyone who cared, had that kind of clearance, everything the Japanese were discussing. The Japanese did not know. They were not aware that we'd broken their code and that we had machines that were decoding every order, every conversation, everything was coming out of Japanese high command in real time. So we knew what they were doing at every step of the way. It was like we were sitting in their meeting rooms, in their planning rooms. We knew, and this is the disagreement among historians, because if you're saying that we knew, then you're also saying that FDR allowed this attack to happen as a precipitating event to arouse the passion of the American people to give him permission to go to war. In other words, we knew in advance, we allowed it to happen, just like it acts as almost like a false flag, which of course we knew we were going to sink the USS Maine when we sent it to Havana, but it was intended to arouse the passion of the American people. It worked. We knew that the Lusitania was being sent to harm's way using our flag and our people as bait for the Germans to sink it, knowing it would arouse the passion of the American people. That was the Spanish-American World War I. It had worked twice. If you, as a historian, believe that, and it's not a matter of question, there's no doubt that we had broken their code. We had these code-breaking machines. We had access to all their intelligence. That's the best intelligence. We don't need spies. We're listening in on everything they're saying. So if that is true, it is also true that FDR and our high command knew that the Japanese were coming. They knew when, they knew how, they knew where, they knew it all, and they sacrificed it. Now, I'll give you some more evidence of that in a minute. Another protection against a naval attack was this gooseneck entrance. As you can see, this is Pearl Harbor from above. And it would be very easy to defend the port by defending the entrance to that port. But the problem is the gooseneck can work for you or against you. In a naval attack, it works for you. That's why this location was chosen. It was chosen way before airplanes and the capacity to even attack somebody by air. It's very easy to defend because all you got to do is keep people out of the entrance, that gooseneck entrance. The problem is an air attack could work against you because if you try to escape and a ship is sunk by one of these airplanes, torpedoed right there in that entrance, when it sinks, it blocks the entrance, or in this case, the exit, and now it traps all the other ships inside that port. So the Japanese are looking at the gooseneck as an opportunity. If we can sink a ship, we'll let one think he's going to escape. We'll let him get in that entrance. We'll sink it right there. And now everybody's trapped. The Americans are looking at the gooseneck like it's a protection. So they have completely different perspectives, which tells you, the Americans have this false sense of security that we can't be attacked by air. It's shallow water. We'll see their carrier groups coming with our radar. We'll know. We'll send up our planes and defend them in the air 100 miles away. But for some reason, we didn't see them coming on the radar. Some reason the attack happened and the Japanese were able to use the gooseneck to their advantage, blocking the exit, so it traps all the American ships inside the port. So there are a number of reasons we thought we were secure from an air attack and from a naval attack, but we didn't realize the Japanese had the shallow water torpedo. And The gooseneck, yes, would protect against a naval attack, but it would actually work against us in an aerial attack. So why didn't we see them coming with our radar? That's the $1 million question, right? What happened? Did they fall asleep? Right? It's not like they're coming with one carrier. They've got 6 carrier groups come. An aircraft carrier doesn't come alone. It's defenseless in and of itself. It doesn't have any guns on it to speak of. It has battleships escorting it, cruisers, subs, and all these planes sitting on top. So here you have what amounts to the largest naval force in the history of the world coming full steam ahead towards Hawaii. And our radar, we said later what we thought they were birds. We thought they were big fish or whatever. That's just that if you believe that, okay, you might as well sign off at this moment and not continue on because you believe anything. But you can see there in the air all these planes. Those aren't birds. Okay, hard to mistake those for birds. It almost, well, it speaks to me of an intentional or a willful ignorance of what's coming. We want it to happen. Whatever radar operator, whatever alarms might have been sent up the chain by these radar operators about what's coming, just either A, were dismissed, out of hand, ignored, disregarded, laughed off, or another way to look at it is, okay, it's working. It's like the spider and the fly, right? Charlotte's Web. Come into my spider, says the spider. Come into my web, said the spider to the web. We knew that in order to get into this war, we've tried everything, but our Congress keeps passing neutrality laws. We can't get in the war. Britain's begging us. They're hanging on for dear life by the hair of their chinny chin chin. Germany's not going to attack us to force our hand. They're too busy with Britain and then later with Russia. But Japan sure has an issue with us. Any chance we have getting in this war involves Japan acting aggressively towards us. And because Japan is allied with Germany, that's going to give us a lot of leeway about who we choose as our first enemy, right? So it might be where we just have to allow something like this to happen, ignore the radar, the sonar, that's telling us, hey, there's this massive fleet coming at us, ignore it purposely, and sacrifice the fleet at Pearl Harbor so as to get the American people to do what we always know the American people will do in moments like this, rally around the flag. At first, the attack was considered a rousing success. You had a bunch of American casualties. I think that was on American soil, an attack on American soil. It was the most casualties up to 9/11. So it lasted quite a few years. 8 battleships were destroyed, 3 destroyers, 3 light cruisers, 160 planes on the ground, and 128 more planes damaged. Notice what you don't see there. What you don't see there are any aircraft carriers. Now remember, the Japanese had intel from their spies that the carriers would be there, but they weren't. The night before, American naval commanders had sent all the aircraft carriers out to sea. I think this is anecdotally some of the most convincing evidence that we knew this attack was coming. This World War I was an argument could be made was a battleship war. World War II, because they had to escort the convoys across the Atlantic and attack the German subs. World War II is going to be all about aircraft carriers. And that's the future, at least that's the present in that moment. We can sacrifice these battleships. We can sacrifice these cruisers and destroyers and certainly planes. They can rebuild those much quicker. We cannot afford to lose the carriers that we have. We got a bunch on order, but they're going to take 2 years to build. We have to save the carriers. So that while they were scheduled to be in port that weekend, just lined up just like this. This is not Pearl Harbor, but that picture shows how they line them up. This is what the Japanese were expecting, but when they got there, they were not there. And Yamamoto was like distraught. He said, "Where are the carriers?" The 7 heavy cruisers were also out to sea with these carriers protecting them. And two things come in across the mind of Yamamoto. First, where are they? Maybe they're out to sea. We should go. But they're not where they're supposed to be, which means there's no way this attack can succeed to the extent we need it to succeed. It's not going to be a devastating blow like we hoped. And secondly, it could turn and backfire on us because word gets to those carrier groups. They're full of planes. They could counterattack while our planes are in the air. They could counterattack us while we're defenseless here and sink all of us. Is this the strategy? This is similar to what we did later in Midway. Nimitz did this in Midway, and it worked. You hide your carriers, and when the Japanese planes leave to go attack Midway, or in this case Pearl Harbor, you send your planes to attack their ships. When the planes turn around and come back and land, all their carriers are sinking, which means their planes are going in the drink. So he canceled the third wave of attack planes once it became clear to him that these carriers and these destroyers were not there. And he knows, this is when he says that famous quote, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant." He knows the attack did not succeed the way he had hoped. And but if our objective was to get into the war, it worked beautifully. We sacrificed these ships that can be replaced. We've sacrificed these planes that can, and we've already demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice American lives. We've done it once in the Spanish-American with the USS Maine. We did it again in Lusitania. If it takes 2,500 lives to get us involved to help Britain, so be it. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned is that Britain, just like they did in World War I, cut the transatlantic cable again, this time, because it worked so well the first time. So we are operating again with limited information coming from Europe, filtered through Britain. And the pump has been primed about, just like in World War I, Wilson was afraid to take a side, Germany or England, because we had so many German immigrants and British immigrants. He didn't want to divide the American people. Well, the same thing is true in World War II. But now, if you have a yellow press or a press that's filtered through Britain, because they've cut the transatlantic cable not once, but twice in World War I and World War II, now all the information we're getting is filtered through them. We're getting a very slanted view of the German people, of the Nazis, of the German war machine. And they can shade their coverage any way they want to arouse the passions of the American people. So you have two things. You have the propagandize of the American people, just like in World War I. We're getting all our information filtered through Britain. All right. And now we have a suppression of evidence. You say, well, what's the suppression of evidence? Well, in World War I, it was the Zimmerman note, right? That wasn't suppression, it was actually the manufacture of evidence. But in this case, it was the suppression of evidence. What was the suppression? How about what the radar and the sonar was telling us? Well, how about what all the intelligence was telling us? That the attack was imminent. We suppressed that so as to encourage it, so as to make sure we were surprised, so as to convince the Japanese that we were asleep at the switch. We suppressed all that evidence. And then what's the precipitating event? In the Spanish-American War case, it was the sinking of the USS Maine, the false flag. In World War I, it was the sinking of the Lusitania. Again, the equivalent of a false flag. And now, in this case, it's Pearl Harbor. Again, the equivalent of a false flag. It's no question who to blame is. It's Japan. And now, if Japan had gotten wind that we knew what they were up to, or that we had broken their code, it would have completely changed the chemistry, the calculus on everything. But they were operating under the assumption we were unaware. But we weren't unaware. We were very aware. And all of their tricks, the delegation meeting at the White House on that day, picking of a Sunday for the attack, all of their little tricks, even the choosing of Pearl Harbor, which we thought was impervious to air and naval attack. Turns out they figured out a way. Their scientists had been busy developing a torpedo for just that very place, for that very purpose. Anyway, the predictable result was one day later, Roosevelt gives a speech to the nation in front of Congress, calls it a date which will live in infamy, talking about the day before. Congress declares war on Japan with overwhelmingly. And now, because they're all allies, 3 days later, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. And so now we're in it. This is now a world war. And now we have a choice to make. And this is where, again, just like the fact that we had radar but didn't know they were coming, just like they were coming after our aircraft carriers, which are supposed to be there, but they were out to sea. There's another third reason why I believe we knew this attack was coming, and it's proven by what we do next. This was all an effort to get us into the war. Now, I don't have any proof of it. I'm using anecdotal evidence. It's circumstantial, is what it is. But I'm also comparing it to past patterns, which happened in World War I and the Spanish-American War, and it's the exact same pattern, the exact same template. What's the template? And this is treason. Okay, and again, so what's this got to do with the deep state? Well, we've already established the fact that the deep state was very interested in the Spanish-American War being fought to create an empire, and that the deep state was very interested in fighting World War I to protect the empire. So what's the deep state's motive to want to fight World War II? We've already established the fact that Allen Dulles will be sent over there to protect his Sullivan and Cromwell clients, these 60 guys that run everything. They run the entire U.S. economy. They own all the big corporations. They run the U.S. government because they make the contributions. And because of World War I, they're now inside the government helping run the war effort. And all they know at some point, this wars might affect all their assets. And what did we learn during the interwar years? They sent a bunch of money and investment and assets over to Germany and Italy to invest and help Mussolini and Hitler's rise to power. It's inconvenient now that we're fighting them. We're going to be fighting them. That's incredibly inconvenient. And it would be extremely embarrassing if the American people learned that Hitler wouldn't be Hitler without American money. And these 60 men that are running everything, these deep staters, American companies like GM and GE, it'd be very embarrassing. And all these assets they have could be destroyed during a war, might be destroyed by our own government, by our own armies. So we send the Dulles brothers and to protect all his Sullivan and Cromwell clients over there, their assets, the fact that they're even doing business over there, the high debt from the American people. So we know that deep staters have a very keen interest in this war in Europe, especially, and in Asia because of the new trade relationships that we've developed with China. So we have extremely motivated people now that are interested in one thing only. Remember, ultravirus has invaded the public sector now, and it's all about profits. We don't care about the public interest. It's all about profits and immunizing themselves from any and all liability before, during, or after, which is what Dulles is going to be sent over there to do, to immunize all these people and all his clients, to protect their assets so they continue to maximize these profits. Now, that means that they're going to continue to do business with our enemy during a war, which means they're aiding and abetting the enemy during the war. While we're fighting the Germans, we're doing business with the Germans. And we got our guy over there protecting, hiding all that information. And afterwards, making sure that their assets don't get destroyed and making sure that their identities don't get revealed. So the deep state has as much motive to want to fight World War II, to protect, again, like World War I, to protect their empire, but also because they've discovered that war is the greatest business model ever created, they're back home owning the companies that provide all the war materials to not just our militaries, but also our allies. So it's a win-win. if we fight this war, if we're involved in this war, we can protect our assets abroad. We have a means by which we can do that. If we're not in the war, we can't do anything about it. They'll just get destroyed. If we're in the war, we can protect our identities. We've got people in key places in government that'll help protect our identities, or the fact, keep quiet what we're doing, aiding and abetting the enemy through all these business relationships. And while we're fighting the war, our allies are fighting the war, carrying out, they're going to be buying from us all the war materials that they need. We're making money over there. Uh, we're making money over here. We're financing our enemies so that the war will go on longer, financing our own side so that we can fight the enemy. I mean, we're making money. It's sort of like people who bet on the stock market, and they hedge their bets by they invest in the stock to go up, but also the stock to go down. So they win either way. Or people who support the Democrat and the Republican by giving campaign donations to both sides in the election season so that they win either way. That's what these deep staters want to do. They want to win either way. But the only way you can win either way is you got to be in the war, to put your people in the right places and to protect the right people in the right companies in the right locations, like deciding where you're going to land your troops and invade. You might not want to invade in over here because I got a factory over here. We certainly don't need to use the strategy that the Russians are using as they retreat. They're burning everything, right? We don't need that. We don't need to destroy all these assets that we have. So we need to, our people. You see what I'm saying? So the treason that was committed to get us in the Spanish-American War was propagandizing the American people through the yellow press, manufacturing the evidence, the Spanish ambassador letter, and creating the false flag attack, which killed American people. That's treason. We ended up going to war over it. Americans died because of a lie. Then World War I, to protect the empire, again, propagandizing the American people. I believe the American government and the British government worked in collusion. The excuse was, well, the British cut the transatlantic cable, so that's why we're getting all our information from Britain. That's a ruse. That's cover. That's a pretext. We wanted that news slanted that way because we had chosen a side, and the side was Britain. But we needed the American people, that pump, to be primed so the American people would support the war. So then we manufactured the evidence, the Zimmerman note. It's never been produced. I don't believe it happened. I believe it was a concoction. And then we sent the ship into harm's way under an American flag, full of Americans, full of contraband, and acted surprised when it got attacked and sunk. And that was the same method, the same template used earlier in the Spanish-American War. So now, in the current time, how about World War II? We see, these deep staters see possibilities here. You know, they've created this sphere of influence in the Far East, which we need to protect from Japan. So there's motive there. And we've created a sphere of influence in Europe during the interwar years with all these companies and these big relationships with these fascist governments, with Hitler and with Mussolini. And we have big business ties with those two governments. And obviously we have assets at risk in those two countries, in those regions. And that's a whole new potential sphere of influence to add to our sphere of influence in the Far East, to add to our sphere of influence in Latin America, to add to our sphere of influence in South America. How about Europe? So there are, quote, American interests at risk here. And it's not military these are not national security interests. If Japan was able to take Manchuria tomorrow, or in World War II, it would not have put the United States national security at risk. If Germany was defeated, Italy was defeated, all the fascists, if all the Axis powers were defeated in World War II, and we were not in the war, none of our national security would be jeopardized. This is not about national security. This is about our national interests. It's really about these 50 or 60 men who run all the corporations, who run the U.S. government, and by virtue of that, pretty much run the world. and all their profits and all their assets that are at risk. And of course, their identity being known that they're doing business with the enemy. They made the enemy, and now they're continuing to do business with the enemy while we're fighting them. That would be scandalous. So all that has to be protected. And if it succeeds, imagine the standing that the Americans would have as a nation state going forward. We could establish a new world hegemony. Hegemony. I always have trouble with that word. Hegemony going forward. It would be the you talk about a new era. You know, it was sort of a new era after World War I because we emerged as the most powerful nation on earth, and the financial sub capital of the world shifted from London to New York. And but what we didn't learn until after World War I ended was just how much money could be made during that war. So the next war, we can't let it end. So we need to keep on a war footing going forward, so that all that money can continue to be made on into the future forever, right? So in order for that to happen, we have to convince the American people that we have national interests at stake. We have, and that after it's over, we have a new boogeyman that we're going to have to continue to stay on a war footing to protect against in the future. Otherwise, we'll be fighting another one of these in 20 years. So there's just a whole slew of reasons. And then underlying all that, it's all about making money. It's all about making money. So for a variety of reasons, we have motive to want to join this war. And so here we go again. It's the propaganda. The British have cut the transatlantic cable again. So we're getting all our information from Europe or about Europe from Britain. And of course, it's slanted. And they're hanging on for dear life. The suppression of evidence, the American people didn't learn until years later that we had broken their code. Because if we know that we broke their code, the obvious question is, well, how did Pearl Harbor happen? That can't be allowed. American people can't be allowed to know that. We didn't find out that until decades later. And then a false flag attack at Pearl Harbor, which the Japanese used diplomacy as a ruse, but we participated. There's no rule that said we had to participate in, but we did, so that we could tell the American people afterwards, look what they did. They attacked us on the same day they were here, supposedly trying to negotiate a peaceful solution to this. They were in our own White House when this attack was starting. And of course, that's going to arouse the American people's fury. And then there was some semblance of a stand down on the code breaking intel, because certainly the radar and sonar would see or be able to detect this massive fleet coming towards America. And for some reason, it didn't happen. And so there's a stand down there. And then you have the aircraft carriers out to sea on unscheduled maneuvers, along with their protective ships. And that, again, was unscheduled. The Japanese had scouted out Pearl Harbor to great lengths so that they knew the schedule as well as we did. And they knew, according to the schedule, that those aircraft carriers were supposed to be there, and they weren't. So I think that is further evidence, again, anecdotal and circumstantial, that the American government allowed Pearl Harbor to happen so that it would force us into the war. And now the second, now that's two pieces of evidence I've given you. The first one is the fact that we had radar and sonar and would know that they were coming, and we stood down. The second one is that we had broken their code and we knew everything that they were planning in advance. The third one is the fact that the ACs, the aircraft carriers, were out to sea. Okay. Again, circumstantial, but evidence nonetheless. You can convict somebody on circumstantial evidence, by the way. And the fourth one has to do with the outcome, the decision that we made. I'm giving you four pieces of evidence I believe show that the American government allowed Pearl Harbor to happen to force our hand, because more than anything, we wanted in that war. So what are the outcomes? In the Far East, the open door policy, which was our access into China and Manchuria and those resources and those markets, were being threatened by Japan. And so there's a motive there. In Europe, the deep state financing of Germany's rearmament, Hitler's rise to power, was at risk. The fact that we had done that, the American people would not be happy to know that, and then all those assets that would be at risk. So here we have motives, but look at it from a different perspective. The outcomes of our meddling in the Far East, the argument could be made that forced Japan's hand. Now, I'm not arguing for Japan interference in China. They weren't the only country interfering in China. Japan just had to be one of them. But when we went there and said we're the new big dog in this part of the world, it threatened Japan. And we went through this yesterday in chapter 19, all the reasons Japan felt threatened by the United States and its involvement in China. And now, because we've declared our sphere of influence in China and we've tried to intimidate Japan into standing down, we've taken their oil, we've done all these different things. We basically forced Japan into a corner, and Japan did what anybody who feels threatened, they're going to either fight or flight, and they're coming out fighting. So now we have a war on our hands because an argument can be made because of our actions. And our actions are just as imperial as their actions, if you get right down to it. And then our actions in Europe, again, just as imperial as anybody else. We're trying to establish new markets and new ways to maximize profits back home. That's why GM and GE and Ford and all these big companies are over there. We're financing Hitler's rise to power, no doubt, with the cooperative arrangement that our companies will benefit from that. And we're basically investing in this fascist dictator, the rise of these fascist totalitarians in Europe. And now they are threatening Europe and the world. So our actions in the Far East have led to Japan's actions, and our actions in Europe have led to Germany and Italy's actions. Because you take America out of both of those equations, Japan is not threatening Pearl Harbor. Certainly, they're threatening China, but they're not worried about the United States because we're not in China. And Germany and Italy are not running roughshod over Europe because they don't have the money, that they might not even be in power. We helped Hitler become Hitler. You take us out of that equation, and Germany is probably still a second-rate power after losing World War I. So we played a significant role in the rise of these fascist states in Europe, and we played a significant role in Japan becoming militaristic and expanding its empire south in the Dutch East Indies and to Malaya and all these other places, because we tried to prevent them going into China. Why? Because that was going to be our place. That was going to be where we got resources and we had markets. We didn't want Japan in there. So, these things, there's a lot of nuance when you look at the cause and effect, how these wars happen. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that these American interests that are expanding into the Far East and to Europe are trying to make money. It's about money. Now, here, fast forward to December 11th, 1941, we're now at war with both. And it's threatening the profits of this deep state, and it certainly is threatening the immunity of the deep state, and it's certainly threatening the identity of these companies and these big owners, these deep state folks, and their role in causing these problems to begin with. And of course, if it's known, then they will not be able to do business with them anymore, especially during a war, and aid and abet our enemy. It's all about keeping all that secret. So that's why deep state operatives such as John Foster Dulles, who was heavily involved in the post-war planning, by the way, and eventually becomes Secretary of State, right? He's one in the room helping draw the maps of the world after World War II ends. And then his brother, Alan Dulles, who we already learned negotiated as an American intelligence official, the secret surrender of the Nazis in Italy, and also operated Operation Sunrise to sneak them out, folks that would be assets to America going forward, our intelligence agencies, but also help protect all his Sullivan and Cromwell clients and all their assets and their identities, etc., that were tied up in Europe and Italy, in Germany and Italy. And that's another example of the private sector ultravirus seeping into, actually by now it's controlling these public servants. These are public servants, just these two. I could name a lot more, but just these two, because they end up getting promoted when the war is over into very high level positions. As I said, John Foster becomes Secretary of State in Eisenhower's government. Allen Dulles becomes director of the CIA under Eisenhower's government. So these are very important people. They are public servants, but they always wear two hats. The one hat says, today I'm representing America because I'm a public servant, but yesterday I was representing Sullivan and Cromwell, or all my clients that I've had for years from Sullivan and Cromwell, these 50 or 60 guys that run the world, these 50 or 60 corporatists, these deep state operatives. And of course, these deep state folks are now directly involved in the government because they've been invited in first by Wilson during World War I, second by FDR in World War II to run the war effort, because they run the companies. They're the ones that created the arsenal of democracy. They're the ones feeding the beast, feeding all our allies literal food, but also the weapons that they need, the ships, the planes, etc. It's coming out of these companies that are owned by these 50 or 60 men. And then they have their representatives, or the people that they hired to represent them, guys like Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles. We learned about Prescott Bush. He was another one from Brown Brothers Harriman. So there is no difference anymore. There's no line of distinction between the private sector and the public sector. Ultravirus is saturating both. And remember now, ultravirus is maximize profits, public interests be damned, and immunize yourself from any and all liability. And that's how now the public sector, the government is working. That's how it's the private sector has operated that way since the Civil War, but now the public sector is operating the same way, which is why Allen Dulles, in his official capacity as the intelligence director in Switzerland, was able to do things that were completely against what his commander-in-chief was ordering him to do. No secret surrender and no immunity for these Nazi war criminals. He's doing both. Neither one's in the public interest, but it's in the interest of his Sullivan and Cromwell clients. It's in the interest of these robber barons / deep staters back home. So he's doing his own thing. Now multiply Allen Dulles exponentially across the board to all these other deep state operatives who have made their way into the government. And they're doing it too in their areas of expertise. And you can see quickly how the United States government becomes beholden to these deep state interests, these folks that are shadowy behind the scenes, they're unaccountable, they're unelected, but they're behind the scenes like Geppetto pulling everybody's strings. And everybody back home is confused about why are we doing this? Well, first of all, most times we don't even know about it. All of these things are happening. We don't find out about it for decades. If we knew about it in real time, there'd be a lot of confusion about what our government was up to. They tell us one thing and do another, and then we don't find out about it for 50 years. But we now have the advantage of history. We can look back and see what they did and realize whose interests they're protecting. It wasn't the American people's interest. It was their clients' interest, these deep staters who are the real power behind the throne. Now, here's the fourth reason, the fourth piece of evidence I point to prove my point. On December 22, 1941, we have a conference in Washington. It's called the Arcadia Conference between British and American military leaders. So you have FDR, you have Churchill, and then you have the militaries. And a decision was made at that point that the Allies would concentrate, at this point, that's America and Britain, would concentrate on defeating Germany first and Italy and worry about Japan later. Now, understand, we just got attacked by Japan. The American people supported the war effort because of what happened at Pearl Harbor. Japan is the boogeyman right now. But we make a decision, our government makes a decision. Okay, we're going to put Japan on the back shelf and we're going to go after Europe first, i.e., Germany and Italy. There's only one way you can see this. Obviously Britain wants us to join them and fight Germany and Italy first because that's who's creaming them every night. That's who's bombing them every night. That's who they're at war with. And they're not at war with Japan right now. So they want us to help in against Germany and Italy. And the promise is that after that is handled, they'll help us against Japan. But they clearly don't see Japan as the bigger threat. And the Americans, by agreeing with them, clearly don't see Japan as the bigger threat either. Now, knowing what we already know about all the interests that we have at stake, the assets that we have at risk in Germany and Italy, and how far along that war is in comparison to the war with Japan, you can see why our government, which is full of these deep staters now, and they're not just whispering in their ear anymore. They're making decisions. They operate the levers of power. Guys like John Foster Dulles and Alan Dulles are going to be sent to Europe. We're going to decide we're going to go fight Germany and Italy first to protect those assets because they are at risk. And we'll worry about Japan later. So the conclusions that I draw from this are A, Pearl Harbor was necessary cover to enter the war. It had to happen somewhere. The Germans were so busy with Britain, and eventually next they're going to be busy with Russia. They don't have time to worry about us. They're not going to attack us, right? They learned from World War I the worst thing that happened was America joining the war. That's why they lost. If America hadn't joined the war, they wouldn't have lost World War I. They learned that lesson. So they're not interested in goading America into the war. Not at that point. Maybe eventually, but not at that point. Japan's a different issue. And so having broken the code and knowing what the Japanese are planning and thinking, we know our best chance of getting in the war is to play this along with the Japanese and allow them to think that we don't know what they're up to and continue this embargo. In fact, add to the embargo to make them more frustrated, to make them more angry, to make them more desperate, to force their hand and attack Pearl Harbor. And we'll stand down the radar, we'll stand down the sonar, so the surprise, it does catch us by surprise, at least the rank and file on the ground. We'll play along with their little negotiating ruse in Washington. We'll pretend like, oh, we were caught by such a surprise because it was Sunday, but just to protect ourselves going forward, the night before the attack, we'll sail our aircraft carriers out to sea so they can't. We'll sacrifice the planes, we'll sacrifice the destroyers and the battleships, but not the aircraft carriers. And then when the war is over, because they are allied with Germany, that gives us an excuse to determine who we want to fight first. Technically, we're at war with all of them. And sure enough, 3 days later, Germany and Italy did declare war on us. So we're at war with all of them. So we get to choose. Do we want to fight Germany, Italy, or Japan? Is Europe a higher priority or is the Far East a higher priority? Well, at this moment, they make the decision that Europe's a higher priority because that's where all that money, that American money is tied up and all it has been invested and all these companies have assets because we financed Hitler and Mussolini's rise to power. We helped make them what they are. And now we're at risk of losing all that. We're not at risk of losing anything in the Far East yet. We don't want to lose Manchuria, and we won't, because in the long run, we can stall Japan long enough so that when the moment comes, we can go and defend our interest in Manchuria and in China. But Britain might lose tomorrow. And if that happens, all of those assets are destroyed and a lot of money goes down the tubes. So we made a cost benefit analysis and we decided that Europe was the play. We call it the Europe first strategy. And Pearl Harbor gave us cover. We had to allow that to happen to give us the excuse or the cover, the pretext to go fight this war. first in Germany and Italy, and then we'll turn our attention to Japan. The special relationship between the United States and Britain was cover for the United States to focus on Europe first. And that gave us permission or allowed us to protect our deep state interests first and foremost. And then we'll worry about national security in Japan. But first and foremost, it's about these moneyed interests, these deep state. And remember now, these deep state folks are the ones making the decisions. They're running the war effort now. So the fact that they're making decisions, why would you expect anything else? National security, they've committed treason 3 times now. They're not worried about national security. They couldn't give a fat flying fig about our national security. It's about protecting their interests, which means money, which means their companies, which means their assets, which means their relationships with these German firms that date back to the interwar years that financed Hitler's rise to power. We can't let the American people find out about that. And that means we're going to have to continue to do business with them during the war, which means we're aiding and abetting the enemy committing treason again. So not only did they commit treason to get us into the Spanish-American War, to get us into World War I, to get us into World War II, during World War II, they continued to do business with these enemies, aiding and abetting the enemy, committing treason again. So, and the public interest doesn't matter. That's ultra vires. So it's not about what's right or wrong. It's not what's in the best interest of the American people. It's what's in the best interest of these deep staters. So I gave you 4 reasons. I hope you remember them. One is the fact that we broke the code, meaning we should have known what was coming at Pearl Harbor. Number 2 is we had sonar and radar. We certainly should have seen them coming or heard them coming. Number 3 is we sailed our aircraft carriers out to sea the night before. So we knew we had to protect them. And just conveniently, and even though the schedule, they were not scheduled to go out on maneuvers. That was completely a surprise. And then number 4, what was our decision after the war or after the battle, after war was declared? Instead of going and fighting the enemy that just attacked us, we go and help Britain, which conveniently had been pump priming the American people with all this slanted propaganda because they cut the transatlantic cable and all that information from Europe was coming through Britain to us. So really there's 5 reasons to think that Pearl Harbor was no different. It was the equivalent of a false flag. It was no different than the USS Maine, the Spanish-American War, and the Lusitania in World War I. The methods are always the same. Propaganda, either the manufacture of evidence or the suppression of evidence, and then thirdly, a false flag, a precipitating event that pushes the American people over the top. And who's behind the scenes pulling the strings and all? It's all about, in the Spanish-American War, creating the empire. And in World War I, it was protecting the empire. And World War II is expanding the empire. For whom? Did we need empire here? Did we need all these resources? Did we need new market? No, it's these owners. It's these deep staters, these unaccountable, unelected people that want to maximize their profits. They don't care about Americans. They don't care about public interest. They immunize themselves. So when it's all said and done, they melt away into the ether. No one knows. And 5 decades later, we still think Pearl Harbor was a surprise. We still think the USS Maine was an attack by the Spanish. We still think the Lusitania was this inhumane, barbaric attack by these German sub-captains on an unarmed, neutral ship full of innocent civilians with no contraband. We still think all that because they control the press. They control the information. All right, that's enough for today. Feel free to subscribe to my channel, smash the like button, and or share. And if you want to join in on the discussion, feel free to comment. Thank you. Have a good day. God bless.